Well, on the budget a couple of weeks ago, we interviewed Stephen Hamilton, Associate Professor of Economics at the George Washington University in Washington. Well, he formerly worked at the Australian Treasury, but he's been a fierce critic of the policies adopted by the Albanese government and also of Treasurer Jim Chalmers. So with a decade of deficits looming, I caught up with him in Canberra today to get his reaction to the budget.
Look, I think we've got to think about the short term and the long term, right? So I think the short term, we have an inflationary crisis. It's been going for 2 years and the RBA thinks it's going to go for another 2 years, right? So we're right in the middle of it. And if anything, the budget last night very obviously made that worse, right? So it added $10 billion to the deficit in the coming financial year on top of the $10 billion on the deficit in the past two budgets. When you add that to the $24 billion for the stage 3 tax cuts, we're pumping $44 billion, which is, 2% of GDP, into the economy at exactly the wrong time. So if anything, with the RBA on a knife edge, I think this kind of pushes them over the line. And if rates rise, you'll know why. Now, the longer term story, I think, is less certain, right? So the government is pegging its hopes on this future made in Australia policy. We got a lot more detail about that last night. But I would say, a lot of these bets are pretty uncertain, right? So we've got things like green hydrogen and, rare earth metals and all sorts of things that we're not yet quite sure whether they'll pan out. But, it remains to be seen.
OK, so then the Treasurer is saying that the budget will bring inflation down. Clearly he's trying to sheet some sort of a responsibility or a weight onto the Reserve Bank to respond and bring interest rates down, or at least not to raise them. Is that your own sense of what the Treasurer is trying to do here?
That claim is a nonsense, Ross. I can't be clearer than this. And the fact that so many economists in the last few days have come out and said that energy rebates push up inflation, and yet the Treasurer continues to say this. It's hard for me not to think that it's a sort of deliberate misstatement, right? So energy rebates, they bring the level of inflation down, of course, because they make electricity cheaper. When they roll off, price goes back up again. But in the meantime, everyone had more money in their pockets, and they went out and spent that money on goods and services, and the price of those things rise. Treasury models the mechanical effect. They don't model those behaviour responses, and so the inflation numbers in the budget just don't reflect what's going to happen.
So the Reserve Bank also has a history of looking through any individual spikes in prices. I think of fruit and vegetable prices during, tropical cyclones, for example. They look through that and they don't move interest rates in response to short-term prices. That's what this is, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. So in fact, if you actually look at the inflation forecast, the energy price relief brings down what we call headline CPI, which is the main number, but it doesn't have as big an effect on underlying CPI, and it's that underlying number that the RBA is focused on. So it's good for people in some sense, right? If you're struggling to pay your energy bills, you're going to have another $300 on top of whatever the state government's doing, but you are going to pay for it. Either you're going to pay for it or someone else is going to pay for it in higher inflation and other things and higher interest rates.
So then take me to one other thing, and that is that there have been two budget surpluses, and the government has been very strong in saying that it has banked the majority of the additional revenue that has come through the door because of very low unemployment and high commodity prices. But from here, there's a decade of deficits. What does that say for the vulnerability of Australia's economy going out over that next decade?
Yeah, look, that's exactly right, Ross. So, if you won, you won 10 grand on a scratchy, would you call yourself a prudent economic manager? Right? So what we have in the short term is we have these massive windfalls coming from Chinese, demand for our exports, high commodity prices. And the budget does a nice job, actually, of stripping all that away and revealing what we call the structural deficit. That is the deficit if these rivers of gold weren't flowing. And what they show is that the budget is not in surplus this year, actually. The budget this year is in deficit when you take those windfalls away. And the government's decisions made that deficit larger. And that deficit grows dramatically over the next 2 years to be 1% of GDP, which is, $27 billion. And then over the next decade, we have those structural deficits remaining. And the only reason they decline over that period of time is by what we call bracket creep, which is that every single one of us is going to be paying more in income taxes to cover that bill. And it's hard to conceive that the government's not going to do anything on taxes over the next 10 years to try and return some of that. So I look at the budget in the long term, and it's very obviously unsustainable.
Okay, because one other, shall I say, dubious honour that this government has got is being the highest taxing government in 23 years. Is that a badge of honour that the government is happily going to go to the next election with?
Well, it's hard to believe, but, you know, in the budget, payments go like this and taxes go like this. And that's why the budget repairs over time. So the last government had a cap on the tax receipts it was willing to collect of 23.9% of GDP. They said, we're not going to let taxes rise above that level. We're going to find other ways to repair the budget. When this government came in, they removed that cap. And frankly, that's something I supported at the time because I thought alternative guardrails were better. But what that means is that they blow right through that tax cap in 3 or 4 years from now. And so, yes, the only way that this government is managing to pay for its spending promises is with ever-rising taxes. And again, it's not clear that that's actually going to happen, right? Whether the politics will allow them to do that.
So you were a fierce critic of Jim Chalmers' first two budgets. This is his third. What's your final assessment of this? Has it improved anything?
So to my mind, certainly as a professor of economics, I guess, I wouldn't be giving this government a passing grade for the way it's dealt with inflation. And I think they've had years to figure it out, and I still don't think they've got the message.